Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about my wide receiver tier list going into the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 60-plus wide receivers as I give you guys my opinions on them, talk about the correlating statistics as we approach the 2020 season, and where they lie in my overall tier list. Now, before we begin today's video, let me remind all of you, subscribe to the channel. We are only 100 subscribers away from 13,000. That'd be an incredible mark to hit before September. You guys have been incredible down in the comment section, smashing that like button. The reason we had such a quick turnaround from yesterday's running back tier list to today's wide receiver tier list is because of your guys' support. You coming in, smashing the like button. You guys I think you guys have already doubled the 300 like mark that I set as a standard to get this video out. You guys have been absolutely fantastic. I cannot thank you enough for the support. For those of you who have continued to support elsewhere on patreon.com or by purchasing my draft guide, I really do appreciate that. The influx there has been awesome. For you guys that are interested in finding my 2020 fantasy football draft guide, go down in the description of the video. We have more information regarding that, where you can find my official rankings. Again, this is only a tier list. This isn't official rankings. You can find the ability to play with me this upcoming season in the fantasy league, weekly rankings throughout the entirety of the season, a private Discord in which we chat and do mock drafts for the off season and during the regular season, a lot of Q&As and live streams there. So again, for those of you who are interested, find that information down in the description. Again, thank you very much for the support, guys. It's been absolutely incredible. So let's talk about the wide receiver position. Again, like I mentioned a couple seconds ago, these are not rankings. Though this is a tier list, and maybe you've seen a tier list in the past in which it's chronologically ordered, my tier lists are not like this because, again, my official rankings are for those of you who have bought in the draft guide and or support on Patreon and get the weekly updates. So this here tier list, though it may look like it's in order, it is definitely not, and yesterday's wasn't either. I've purposely blundered it into an extent to where it's completely out of order, and even if you guessed, you couldn't find my actual order of the rankings because it's really kind of messed up. But either way, this is my tier list for this upcoming season. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Again, if we get to another 300 likes, we'll do the quarterback one just around the corner. Let's go ahead and let's begin today's video. And though I'm going to be talking about Michael Thomas first, yes, he's the number one ranked, but this is not ranked. I'm going to say it again. Okay, thank you very much. Here we go. Michael Thomas. So let's talk about Michael Thomas and again, I could be here for many hours. I'd probably be here for 5 hours, but I'm going to try to keep this concise. There's 60 players. I'm probably going to lose my voice by the end of this, so bear with me. Here we go. Michael Thomas last season broke the record for the most receptions by a single wide receiver in a season, breaking Marvin Harrison's 18-year record of 143 total targets. On top of it, in the past 2 seasons, he's surpassed 80% catch rate and has been absolutely unstoppable since coming into the league back in 2016? Out of Ohio State University. This guy's been nothing but fantastic for the Saints and has never produced anything less than the number 7 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. On top of that, last season had 10 games of 100 plus receiving yards and 9 games of 10 plus receptions. Michael Thomas is in a league of his own, and though we are not allowed to put him by himself in the S tier, he deserves it. 100% far and away the best wide receiver in the National Football League, especially with the fact that he didn't have Drew Brees for about 6 games last year. Teddy Bridgewater did help him out a lot, and overall, he's a monster. Moving on. Another wide receiver I wanted to mention, Tyreek Hill. Now, I understand, and I'll be the first one to say it. Tyreek Hill is an extremely volatile wide receiver in the National Football League, but he's associated with one of, if not the best quarterback in the National Football League as it currently stands. If and when Tyreek Hill is healthy, he is a top 5 wide receiver, and he's proven that in the past, finishing as the number 1 in 2018 and the number 4 in 2017 in half PPR scoring formats. On top of it, when he's healthy, he's able to get plays done just outside of the passing game. Either it's a punt return specialist, kick return specialist, or even in the offense on the ground. He's had 2 seasons in his career thus far of 150 plus rushing yards. He's an extremely versatile but volatile receiver. And even last season with all the injuries, when he was healthy, if we don't count the games he missed, of course, and week 1 where he got hurt against the Jaguars, and week 11 which he got hurt against the Chargers in Mexico City. If we don't count those games, he was averaging 15.62 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format last year. He is a S-tier wide receiver. He will reclaim that this upcoming season, and that's why I mentioned him here. Here we go. Moving on to the next wide receiver that I wanted to go over. We're talking about, here it is, Davante Adams. Could you have guessed it? I mean, it's not really a surprise. Davante Adams is one of my favorite wide receivers in the National Football League, and a lot of people don't put enough respect on his name outside of the fantasy football community. But in the fantasy football community, we all know what he's about. He's the only wide receiver to score 40 touchdowns in the past 4 seasons. He had 3 consecutive years of 10-plus touchdowns, which was in 2016, 17, and 18. And though he missed 4 games this past season, even once he returned, he really reestablished himself and showed everyone just how valuable he is to this offense. Once he returned and played the last, 8 games of the season, he averaged 15.11 fantasy points per game in that stretch. He had 7 games of 10-plus targets in that stretch, yeah. He had 7 of those 8 games were 10-plus target games. You know that in the Green Bay offense, when there's nobody else to target, and he is the only guy that's feasting from Aaron Rodgers' success, he's going to be, a 10-touchdown, 1,000-yard receiver easily. Davante Adams is no joke. We saw it in the playoffs against the Seahawks and in the 49ers. He's proven to everyone how good he is and how capable he is. And he's going to go again and do that once again this upcoming season. Moving on, let's talk about our next wide receiver and the last wide receiver of our S tier, Julio Jones. Now, Julio Jones gets here because of his consistency. Because to be honest, I think he should be on the tier below because Julio Jones has struggled heavily with touchdowns. The other guys, Michael Thomas, 9 touchdowns a year, pretty much on average. Tyreek Hill's always going to be in that range of 10 plus, and so will Davante Adams. But Julio Jones has always been on that fringe of 1 year I'll get 8, then I'll end up with 6, and then I'll screw you over with 3. That in itself is too scary, but his consistency has got him to the dance, and he's going to be an S-tier wide receiver once again because he's finished as the number 3, 5, 5, 6, 2, and 8 wide receiver in just the past 6 seasons in a half PPR scoring format. Last season, he had 6 games of 100-plus receiving yards. When he was targeted 10-plus times last season, he averaged 18.78 fantasy points per game in those 7 games he was targeted 10 times. He's a monster. And to be honest, I think he needs more opportunity. I think he needs to be targeted more. And, as being perhaps, if not the best wide receiver in the National Football League in terms of overall skill and not fantasy value, I think Matt Ryan's got to look at him a little bit more to kind of help us out in fantasy. All right, moving on. We're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about our A tier, starting off with Chris Godwin. Though the A tier is a smaller tier, my goodness, Chris Godwin is a fantastic value pick this upcoming season. Though he is kind of falling down on draft boards, ending up in perhaps the middle to late second round, he's an incredible pick. Last season, again, he didn't even play a full season, only played 14 games, averaged 16.65 fantasy points per game, was the number 2 overall wide receiver last year with only 14 games played. On top of it, he has Brady, the GOAT, coming down to Tampa Bay. It is happening. We have to understand just how valuable a guy like Chris Godwin is with Tom Brady on roster. Last season with Julian Edelman in the slot, Julian Edelman had 153 total targets last year and had 10 games of 10 plus targets. If you go ahead and you take a slot specialist like Chris Godwin, who last year played 63.4% of his offensive snaps from the slot, had 838 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns from the slot, and add Tom Brady, who is a far more accurate and incredible passing quarterback in comparison to Mr. Jameis, I had LASIK, eat W's, and go to the market and get yourself some crab legs, Winston, then we're talking about Chris Godwin taking that next step up into the elite wide receiver conversation. And the fact that he plays in the NFC South, I mean, come on. That is just perfect. Last season, he averaged 23.26 fantasy points per game against the NFC South competition. He is one of the best wide receivers in the league, and it's only getting better for him this upcoming season. Moving on. The next and the last A-tier wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins, another player that, though he was in the S-tier conversation, I thought to myself, maybe this upcoming season is not the year for DeAndre Hopkins. Though he was good last year, 14.5 fantasy points per game on average, it was a bit of a dip in comparison to his career average. Obviously, barring that one season with Brock Osweiler, which was an absolute mess, to say the very least. But regardless, finding a new quarterback is not going to be the thing that kind of slows down DeAndre Hopkins this upcoming season because he's played with 10-plus quarterbacks in his career just in Houston. So to understand that, sure, even with TJ Yates and Matt Schaub and Brandon Weeden and Ryan Fitzpatrick and Case Keenum, it didn't matter who the quarterback was. Deshaun Watson sure was the most talented of the group, but it did not matter. DeAndre Hopkins is always going to succeed, and that's why he stays in this A tier regardless of where he goes, because he's going to find himself perhaps a little bit less of a experienced quarterback that has less of an arm in terms of the deep ball and not being as, I guess, seasoned. But overall, the offense in Arizona is going to complement him. The thing that he struggled with the most was the fact that there was never a number 2 wide receiver for Houston. There was no one else to pull away coverage. And sure, there were games in which Will Fuller was a monster, but it was only short-lived until he got injured. This upcoming season, in a spread offense that wants to run 3 or 4 wide receiver formations, DeAndre Hopkins is going to be flanked by a Christian Kirk on the other side of the field. You have yourself Larry Fitzgerald in the slot, Kenny Drake out of the backfield, in an offense that, in my opinion, is going to open up more opportunity for him. Though it doesn't launch him into the S tier, I think he's an incredible valued wide receiver this upcoming season. Moving on, let's talk about our B tier. Again, DJ Moore is one of my favorite fantasy prospects, and if you haven't seen my video on him, my player profile, you can go get a better insight in terms of my thought process on him and a deeper understanding in terms of statistics. But a couple of the stats that I wanted to pull. Last season, DJ Moore only played 14 games. A lot of people won't remember that, but in those 14 games, he averaged 13.31 fantasy points per game. If he had played an entire 16-game season with that average, he would have finished as wide receiver number 7. Why isn't he being drafted at number 7, at the number 7 wide receiver spot? Because to be honest, I continue to find him in the 4th or 3rd round. That in itself, disrespectful. And I love it, because if you're going to disrespect DJ Moore and you're going to allow me to draft him later in my draft, beautiful. I'll take it. On top of the fact that he plays in the NFC South and he averaged 15.5 fantasy points per game against that competition. And he last season had 10 games of 9+ targets, which in those games he averaged 14.54 fantasy points per game. And he gets a better quarterback in the name of Teddy Bridgewater, who helped Michael Thomas even stay consistent last year. You go ahead, you had this entire formula up. My goodness, DJ Moore is going to be a great wide receiver once again this upcoming season. Moving on, another NFC South wide receiver. You kind of see the trend, right? We already have Julio up here, Michael Thomas, Chris Godwin, DJ Moore, and Mike Evans. All of, except for Calvin Ridley, who's coming soon, has already been talked about, because the NFC South is 100% the best division for the wide receiver position, and they perhaps have the most talented wide receivers. But Mike Evans is a tricky one, because last year Mike Evans had 3 games which really defined his season. 41-point game, a 37.3-point game, and a 30-point game, which accounted for 31 receptions, 568 yards, and 6 touchdowns. And though those 3 games were incredible, the rest of the time, in the other 10 games he played prior to his injury, he only averaged 9.09 fantasy points per game. I understand that, and I mentioned that logic, and I mentioned those statistics so that we can all stay on the same page. Mike Evans was a victim of Jameis Winston's play. Jameis Winston at times ignored Mike Evans last year. I thought Mike Evans owed him money. Like, legitimately, I was so confused as to why there would be a game where Mike Evans would have 0 catches against the New Orleans Saints of all secondaries. But it is what it is. Mike Evans has never had less than 1,000 receiving yards in his career. He gets Brady the GOAT to show up, similar to the bonus that Chris Godwin will get. I think Mike Evans will benefit from it overall, because the offense will have more opportunity. He will see more opportunity, and hopefully the red zone targets are going to be there this upcoming season. I think Mike Evans is a great option. Moving on, our final B tier wide receiver, Kenny Golladay. Now, Kenny Golladay has been consistent, and he has proven himself over the last couple seasons. In 2018 and 2019, he's been a 1,000-yard receiver, regardless of who's under center. Now, I know Matthew Stafford, he's a far better quarterback than the Ryan Finleys or the David Blows of the world. And even with Matthew Stafford last year, he was fantastic. He's going to once again claim his starting quarterback spot in Detroit and finally allow this team to find their success that they really need to find, and hopefully allow us fantasy owners to pay, get a little bit more value out of a Kenny Golladay, despite him being an incredible value already last season. In the 8 games that he played with Matthew Stafford from weeks 1 through 9, he averaged 15.19 fantasy points per game. That in itself, incredible. Again, another statistic that's pretty ridiculous. We know he's a big-bodied receiver, but he's going to get big yards because he's going to make big plays. 5 games of 100-plus receiving yards last season. On top of it, had the most deep pass targets last season with 37 targets of 20-plus yards, leading to 16 receptions, 628 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns. He's a big play guy. He might not have 80 receptions by the end of the year, but he's going to try to get double-digit touchdowns, which we've seen in Detroit be a pretty common thing, especially with Marvin Jones in the past, Calvin Johnson in the past. It's not really a rare thing, especially with Matthew Stafford, the gunslinger, coming back. Moving on, let's talk about our C tier. Here it is, Mr. Allen Robinson. Another one of these receivers that I like a lot, that though I may be undervaluing him in comparison to where you have him, I think Allen Robinson perfectly kind of establishes and begins the C tier because of the quarterback situation. Now, I know quarterback situation, we don't know who's going to start, whether it's Trubisky and or Nick Foles, but just remember how good he was with Trubisky regardless last season. From weeks 12 through 17 of last year, he was averaging 16 points per game. Matt Nagy was truly funnel targeting him, and the offense was flowing through Allen Robinson ultimately. In that 6-game stretch, he was averaging 11.33 targets per game. And overall last season, he had almost 25% of the offensive target share of the Chicago Bears, having 24.44 of it. In itself, I understand Allen Robinson is in a very tricky situation because the offense isn't great. He doesn't have an incredible second wide receiver, though Anthony Miller has improved over the years. I don't think that there's somebody that's going to come and pull some pressure away from him. He is one of the better wide receivers in the league. He plays in a division which the secondary isn't great. There are some teams that have, the safeties of the Minnesota Vikings or the corners of Green Bay are talented, but ultimately I think there's a very good opportunity where Allen Robinson can continue to succeed in this division. If you want more information, you can go check out my video that I talked about him, my player profile. Otherwise, he is a part of the C tier. Moving on, let's talk about Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen's season was cut short last year due to various injuries. Again, let's not forget what Adam Thielen produced in 2018 because he was a top 12 wide receiver with Stephon Diggs also being a top 12 wide receiver that year. I mean, Adam Thielen from weeks 1 through 7 of last year was still Adam Thielen. I mean, it's not like he disappeared week 1. He was still Adam Thielen, averaging 13.53 fantasy points per game. And even if he gets injured and once he comes back, he's not able to kind of pick up anything, and he's really still kind of coddling his injury, trying not to get injured again and trying to stay healthy for the playoffs. I really think we got to look back at 2018 to kind of establish what he's capable of. Let's not forget, again, besides being a wide receiver 1, he had 8 consecutive games of 100 plus receiving yards to start the 2018 season. That's the kind of receiver we're talking about. A guy that easily can be a part of the top 12 this year, and in the playoffs against New Orleans proved why he is a top 12 wide receiver in this league, having 129 yards receiving on that defense. All in itself kind of speaks for itself, in my opinion. Moving on to our next wide receiver, we have Bobby Trees. Now, for those of you in the comment section who are always calling him Bobby Trees, I put respect on the name. To be honest, Robert Woods, similar to Adam Thielen, is kind of disrespected to the extent because though he was a top 12 wide receiver in 2018 and a half PPR scoring format, last season was a little difficult. Though Robert Woods did miss 1 game last year, if he had played all 16 games, he would have been a top 12 receiver. In the last 6 games of the season, from weeks 10 through 17, he was averaging 15.53 fantasy points per game. Those are S-tier numbers in terms of the wide receiver position, something you want to see. Last season, he had 10 games and 9+ targets, and with them losing Brandon Cooks in the passing game and trading him away to Houston, that opens up more opportunity for him to kind of pick up exactly where he left off. That back stretch of the season was him, Cooper Kupp, and Tyler Higbee feasting, and they weren't even targeting the running back that often. So if we can once again see that out of LA, I think Robert Woods, Mr. Bobby Trees, could be an incredible wide receiver this upcoming season, and definitely a top 12 guy in the C tier. Moving on, we have Amari Cooper. Now, Amari Cooper, though a lot of people kind of throw shade on him, I understand. He's a very inconsistent wide receiver, and though that is the case, and 1 week he'll put up 28, and the next week he'll put up 2.8, I do see that there is value in Amari Cooper. Since coming to the Dallas Cowboys, he's played 25 games there, and he's averaged 13.56 fantasy points per game in his career with the Cowboys. Last year, he dealt with injuries, and now this upcoming season, with Dak Prescott having an offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore and a kind of offensive guru in Mike McCarthy kind of looking over this offense, improving everything overall. Sure, you lose Travis Frederick in terms of the offensive line, but outside for Amari Cooper, teams are going to be covering Michael Gallup like he's the number 1. They've gone out and they said Michael Gallup is our number 1. Teams are going to look at Michael Gallup and try to shut him down. You bring in CeeDee Lamb, he's going to pull attention away. You still have Blake Jarwin. I think there are so many weapons in this Dallas Cowboys offense that it's going to eventually open up some opportunity and continue to allow Amari Cooper to feast as he's done in the last couple of seasons with the Dallas Cowboys. Again, he's one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League and a part of the C tier at this moment in time. Moving on. Juju Smith-Schuster. Now, Juju Smith-Schuster, I was intending on putting him a little bit earlier, but his name didn't fit. So, again, not in order. These are not rankings, regardless. Juju Smith-Schuster, kind of like Adam Thielen, was a 2018 monster, a top 12 guy. Even with Antonio Brown feasting in 2018, Juju Smith-Schuster was unstoppable. I mean, he had 26 red zone targets, which was the second most in the league that season. He had 10 games of 10-plus targets in that season, was averaging 15.1 fantasy points per game. And to be honest, in comparison to last year, in which he didn't have Big Ben, and the offense was just completely losing itself with the quarterback play from Mason Rudolph and or Duck Hodges, they were just a shell of themselves. On top of the fact that he was hurt last season. Juju Smith, in my opinion, is probably the comeback player of the year this year. I'm hoping that that's going to be the case. And again, though I kind of value him in the C tier, I think he's a very capable top 12 wide receiver this upcoming season. Moving on to our last C tier wide receiver, we have Cooper Kupp. You guys knew it was coming. One Ram in the top 12, there's no way. Cooper Kupp, in my opinion, is one of these wide receivers that I can't get enough of in my drafts. Now, I might have a bias because I'm a Rams fan, but just looking at his statistics from the last couple seasons, it's kind of undeniable. In the last 23 starts for Cooper Kupp in which he stayed healthy and didn't leave the game with an injury, he's averaged 14.67 fantasy points per game. Last season, he had 8 games and 9-plus targets, and he's 100% Jared Goff's safety blanket in this respective offense. In fact, last season at the beginning of the year, when the offense was kind of struggling and really trying to find their footing without being able to run the ball 30 times a game with Todd Gurley, they looked to a guy like Cooper Kupp, and Jared Goff funnel targeted him 17.33 fantasy points per game for the first 8 weeks. That is not something that we should be surprised about because he did that once again in the beginning of the 2018 season, which he was averaging about 18 fantasy points per game to start. All in all, Cooper Kupp, an extremely valuable wide receiver. And next to Robert Woods, Robert Woods is going to pull his attention. Cooper Kupp's sitting in the slot, just feasting, similar to how Chris Godwin's going to feast while Mike Evans is on the outside. Regardless, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about our next tier of players, starting off with the second-year stud, A.J. Brown. Now, A.J. Brown, though a lot of people look at him and think, okay, A.J. Brown, Ryan Tannehill, can we trust him? He had a lot of touchdowns last year, 10, and the fact of the matter was that a lot of them were scored in the second half of the season. Can we anticipate him having a similar year without any other wide receiver help? Corey Davis, not really great at all. And Jonnu Smith's going to get touches here and there. But here's the thing about A.J. Brown. Ultimately, the biggest factor was that last season, in comparison to when he was with Marcus Mariota or Ryan Tannehill, it was a huge increase in overall productivity for him. He was averaging 14.48 points per game in a half PPR scoring format as soon as they made that switch. As soon as the Chargers game went and they were, off, what was it, week 7 through 17, those 10 weeks, he was just a different wide receiver. And because the quarterback play was productive enough to feed him the ball, whether it was on the ground or through the air, A.J. Brown was unstoppable. And I think regardless of what he's surrounded with, he's still going to be the number one wide receiver there. I'd love to see him get more targets. Anytime you can see a wide receiver get more opportunity, especially for them being as productive as A.J. Brown was last year, I want to see him succeed more. I think D tier is perhaps too low for him. He's capable of being a C tier player and a top 12 player, but at this moment in time, we leave him at the D tier because, again, he will be accompanied by a lot of studs and a lot of second-year monsters. On to some other second-year studs this upcoming season. We have ourselves DJ Chark of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Again, DJ Chark is one of my favorite wide receivers going into this upcoming season. Like I've mentioned before in my player profile video about him, so if you guys are looking for more information, you go check that out. From weeks 1 through 14, the 13 games that he started prior to getting injured, he was averaging 13.93 fantasy points per game. If he had maintained that and not played through the final 3 games of the season injured, he would have potentially, if stayed healthy, finished as the number 8 overall wide receiver in fantasy last season. That in itself, an incredible number. From weeks 1 through 13, he was the number 5 wide receiver. He was an unstoppable force last season, and I think once again this year, with the game script for the Jacksonville Jaguars likely being, hey, we're down, Minshew, Chark, get it done, we got to come back in the second half. I think Chark has a lot of potential this upcoming season. And in comparison to an A.J. Brown and the way that the Titans play, they want to play defense, they want to run the ball. It's a far different scheme in terms of garbage time to opportunity. You can weigh them differently, but regardless, I think they're both similarly rated wide receivers this upcoming season. Moving on, another second-year stud, Again, these wide receivers popped off last year. Sorry, I think DJ Chark's going into his third year. That's a mistake by me. Regardless, Terry McLaurin, Dwayne Haskins. Dwayne Haskins, though he was hurting his value once he took the starting job last year, ultimately these two have a chemistry. I mean, they played at Ohio State together. And now that they're reunited, they've gotten more chemistry this offseason. They know each other's tendencies. They know each other's looks. And they're definitely going to make each other better. I mean, McLaurin, according to PFF, is the second best rookie wide receiver in terms of grade in the past decade, only behind Odell Beckham Jr. With the growth of the offseason and the growth of the offense, I think ultimately Terry McLaurin is going to have himself another good year here and should be a pretty good D-tier wide receiver. Moving on to our next wide receiver, we have Tyler Lockett, another one of these wide receivers that I love to grab in my 4th and 5th rounds of my drafts because, again, they're being extremely undervalued. And though Tyler Lockett is, potentially going to be the number 2 of this team this upcoming season, I still think he is far better in line for fantasy points than a DK Metcalf. In the past 2 seasons, Tyler Lockett has been the rock of this offense. I mean, besides the fact that Russell Wilson has thrown 31 plus touchdowns in 4 out of the last 5 seasons, Tyler Lockett has been a huge benefactor of that. 18 touchdowns in the past 2 years. And though he's only averaged 70 targets in the first 4 years of his career, this past season, he blew out every number, set career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, yards per catch. I mean, he was doing it all at a high level, and he's going to continue that. And it helps that DK Metcalf's now on the outside and has more experience because when you put Tyler Lockett in the slot, he's even that much more valuable because he's playing that Doug Baldwin role that we're also familiar with. Moving on. Talking about another receiver that is going in the 4th and 5th round. In the last NFC South wide receiver of this upper tiers of wide receivers, Calvin Ridley. I think Calvin Ridley can potentially be the Chris Godwin of this upcoming season. He's been great in his entire career. I mean, 17 touchdowns in the past 2 seasons. That number in itself, incredible. The fact that he's averaged, or last season averaged 15.74 fantasy points per game against the NFC South, amazing. Julio Jones is on the other side of the field, therefore pulling double coverage while you can play against the second best corner of every respective defense every week. That is the stuff that I want to see. And to be honest, I think Calvin Ridley is just a couple years away, if not this year, away from being a top 12 potential wide receiver. I'm not even kidding. I think if Matt Ryan can step up to the plate and this offense can find its footing, easily Calvin Ridley can be a top 12 wide receiver. Though he sits in the D tier, this is his base minimum. He's at very least going to be in the teens, a wide receiver 2, if he stays healthy for a full season. If he goes ahead and he plays a full season and at the pace that we anticipate, the sky's the limit for a guy like Calvin Ridley. Moving on. Another wide receiver that, in my opinion, kind of slept on. Devontae Parker was one of, if not the best wide receivers after week 4 of the fantasy football season. Now, when we think about Devontae Parker, you kind of correlate him continuously with the fact that he's been a bust since he came out of LSU. The Dolphins really was struggling to kind of find him in a situation in which they could, lead him to succeed. But ultimately, it really took Ryan Fitzpatrick to find him and make him a relevant wide receiver. And that's what he did this last season. After the quarterback situation was settled by week 4, that's when Devontae Parker found his footing. From week 4 through week 17 of last season, in a half PPR scoring format, only Michael Thomas scored more points than Devontae Parker at the wide receiver position last season. That in itself, an incredible statistic. And though he may have a difficult schedule in terms of strength of schedule this upcoming season for this offense, let's not forget, he can play against the best. By goodness sake, he played against Stephon Gilmore in week 17 of last year and caught 8 passes for 137 receiving yards. That was the defensive player of the year. And he got killed by Devontae Parker in week 17, and they beat the New England Patriots. Sorry, Patriots fans. It's just stats. Moving on. Michael Gallup, our final wide receiver of this list. And again, though Amari Cooper is a very valuable prospect, Michael Gallup is just on his tail, if not going to catch him. If Michael Gallup had stayed healthy for the entirety of the 2019 season, he would have produced more fantasy points than Mr. Amari Cooper. I mean, after Michael Gallup returned from his injury in week 5, from week 5 through 17, he was the number 13 overall wide receiver in half PPR. If he stays healthy, like Mike McCarthy said, and like I mentioned earlier, they want him to be the number 1 wide receiver of this team. I mean, the way that Dak's playing, the way that Gallup's playing, I mean, he's easily a top 24 wide receiver, but could ultimately jump into the C tier and talk about being a potential top 12 if, in fact, Amari Cooper drops, of course. Moving on to our next tier, we talk about Keenan Allen to begin the E tier. And though Keenan Allen has a little bit of a downgrade at the quarterback position, because I do believe Philip Rivers is a better passing quarterback than Tyrod Taylor and or Justin Herbert at this moment in time, I do think that Keenan Allen is a guy that is being extremely slept on. Ultimately, just look at what he's done in the past 3 seasons. Has had averaged about 100 receptions per season. In fact, has had over 300 receptions in the past 3 years. Has averaged over 1,100 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns per season. That in itself speaks for itself. And in my opinion, regardless of the quarterback, he is going to be a successful wide receiver in the National Football League this year. Because again, when I go and I look at what Tyrod Taylor did in Buffalo, whether he funnel targeted Sammy Watkins or in Cleveland a couple years back, in which, yeah, he may have had a little bit of a short stint when Baker Mayfield eventually took his job. But regardless, he was funnel targeting Jarvis Landry there. I mean, he targeted him 22 times in the first 2 games of the season. That's what I potentially want to see with Keenan Allen and could hopefully lead to his upcoming success. Moving on, Courtland Sutton. Now, Courtland Sutton is a very interesting prospect because once Drew Lock took the starting spot, Courtland Sutton kind of disappeared. I mean, he really disappeared. Did not surpass 10 plus fantasy points in the games where Drew Lock was the starting quarterback, and that scares me. But ultimately, Courtland Sutton is a very talented wide receiver. Big body guy, red zone threat. And I think if this offense has kind of found their footing this offseason and they found a little bit of a connection in the passing game, Courtland Sutton could be a very capable top 24 wide receiver. I think he's going to heavily depend on touchdowns because he's one of these bigger body guys like Kenny Golladay. And though he's not going to have incredible yards, incredible touchdown numbers, or incredible reception numbers, he's going to be, a 65, 1,005 kind of guy. And that in itself lends him into this E tier with definitely the potential of being better for sure. Moving on, DK Metcalf. I like DK Metcalf a lot. And like I mentioned with Tyler Lockett, Russell Wilson's thrown the ball to receivers in the end zone 31 plus times in the past, 4 out of the last 5 years. 31 passing touchdowns, 4 out of the last 5 years. That's an incredible statistic. And last season, DK Metcalf had a lot of red zone targets, on top of the fact had the most end zone targets in the National Football League. They want to find him on a deep route with his 4.3 speed, big body, catch it in stride, and score. DK Metcalf is a very capable wide receiver, and this upcoming season with more experience and him potentially taking the number 1 wide receiver role of this offense and running away with it could be a very valuable prospect. I think ultimately it's just going to depend on him and his ultimate catch rate. I mean, last year his catch rate really, really low. If you go ahead and increase that, you're going to find so much more statistics and or numbers that are going to benefit him ultimately. All right, moving on. Stephon Diggs. Now, Stephon Diggs has been a top 12 guy in the past. Back in 2018 was that with the Minnesota Vikings. And last year, the Minnesota Vikings, without Adam Thielen, kind of heavily running the ball with Kevin Stefanski's offensive mindset, they really just pounded the rock. And even with that, Stephon Diggs was ultimately able to find himself some value. Now he finds himself with a new home in Buffalo. And the question is going to be, what kind of value is he going to have? I think it's top 24 for certain because, again, with John Brown posting top 24 numbers last year, Stephon Diggs is a far more talented wide receiver. And with Josh Allen finding a little bit more experience this past season, I ultimately see Stephon Diggs being a top 24 guy. He's been pretty good in the deep ball game in the past couple of seasons. That's where John Brown succeeded the most last year in this offense. I think ultimately Stephon Diggs is going to be a pretty good player this year. Speaking about the deep ball, T.Y. Hilton hasn't caught one of those in a while. Now, T.Y. Hilton, even at the beginning of last season, was a very sustainable wide receiver, putting up 10 points per game on average, even with Jacoby Brissett. But it's nothing similar to what Andrew Luck was able to kind of allow T.Y. Hilton to do. I mean, with Andrew Luck, T.Y. Hilton was a wide receiver that was putting up 1,200 plus receiving yards, 6 touchdowns, 80 receptions a season. And though I expect him to kind of get back to those numbers this year with Philip Rivers, his health is going to definitely be a concern. He needs to stay healthy, and if he does, I think Philip Rivers can definitely help him out and kind of help him post Keenan Allen numbers in the last couple seasons. Moving on, Tyler Boyd. Tyler Boyd gets a lot of value because of Baker Mayfield. I mean, in comparison to Andy Dalton, is a huge difference. Andy Dalton is a backup now for a reason. And Joe Burrow is a guy that threw 60 touchdowns at LSU and went undefeated and won the national championship with relative ease. He's coming into an organization that has a lot of offensive pieces and improved offensive line. Ultimately, It's a great scenario for him. Tyler Boyd is a slot receiver through and through. And the fact that Joe Burrow funnel targeted the slot position at LSU and he's going to once again do it in this offense excites me. On top of the fact, with AJ Green coming back, let's not forget, guys, 2018? Or the last time that Tyler Boyd and AJ Green played on the field at the same time, Tyler Boyd was always better in terms of his fantasy points per game when AJ Green was on the field because AJ Green was pulling double coverage every time. If that happens again this year, Tyler Boyd, a guy that's had over 1,000 receiving yards each of the last 2 seasons, going to be another great wide receiver. Moving on, the last wide receiver of this group, Odell Beckham Jr. Now, I understand OBJ is a very interesting prospect, and many of you may be avoiding him, and you definitely can. But at this moment in time, I think he could definitely play into the role that Stephon Diggs played for the Vikings last year. If Odell Beckham Jr. in a run-heavy offense with the Browns is going to be the play-action deep ball receiver, I think ultimately he can put up 1,000 yards, 6 touchdowns, 75 receptions like he did last year. And maybe with the upside of catching a couple more passes here and there with a better catch rate. Again, he had a 58% catch rate last year. Odell Beckham Jr. could be one of the better receivers in the league. Again, he's got the talent. He's proven it before. But is he capable of getting there? It's going to be ultimately how much opportunity he gets. If he gets 133 targets this upcoming season, increases his catch rate to about 68%, Odell Beckham's easily top 24, if not better. Moving on to our next tier, we're talking about our F tier and one of my favorite wide receivers this upcoming season. We're talking about Jamison Crowder. I talked about him a little bit ago in a video talking about sleeper wide receivers. Let's not forget how valuable Jamison Crowder was last year. I mean, with Sam Darnold, these 11 games they played together, he averaged 11.32 fantasy points per game. And if he had stayed healthy, if Sam Darnold had stayed healthy for the entire year, Jamison Crowder would have been a top 24 wide receiver easily. Last season, he had 8 games, 8+ targets. In those games, he was averaging 14.36 fantasy points per game. They get rid of Robbie Anderson. They really don't have anything else. I mean, sure, you bring in Bashard Perriman and Denzel Mims, but ultimately, Jamison Crowder is the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. And he's going to continue to be the safety blanket in this West Coast scheme that always wants to kind of warm up and kind of allow Sam Darnold to find his rhythm. And where he finds that rhythm is in Jamison Crowder. I mean, just go look at how many times on the first drive of a game, Jamison Crowder was targeted. I mean, I remember on Sunday mornings looking at my phone, Jamison Crowder, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 42 yards, and a touchdown in the first drive. And then after that, he disappears. And that's fine. But he's always going to be that guy for Darnold in this offense. Moving on. Another slot receiver that we like a lot this offseason, Julian Edelman. Now, understand, Tom Brady's not going to be there. But he's going to be the number 1 guy for Cam Newton. I mean, there's a reason why Julian Edelman was a top 12 wide receiver last year in half PPRs because he's a talented guy. If you want to funnel target him, even better. And I do think they're going to because he's the best receiver on this offense and Cam Newton knows it. So if and when they go ahead and they find themselves, kind of finally meshing, and hopefully they've already done that throughout this entirety of this offseason and or preseason workouts, Julian Edelman's going to be a valuable prospect. He's going really late in drafts, 7th, 8th round. And I love that because, again, we know what he's capable of. And we know that regardless of who plays quarterback, even if it's Cam or Jarrett Stidham or Brian Hoyer, they're going to funnel target Julian Edelman. He will find value. Moving on. Marvin Jones, another one of these sleeper wide receivers that I really like. Marvin Jones, in the time span in which Matthew Stafford was fully healthy last year, Marvin Jones was a really, really reliable wide receiver. In fact, he averaged 13.86 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 9 in that 8-game stretch. Ultimately, Marvin Jones, like we talked about in the past, has been a top 12 wide receiver. I mean, the Detroit Lions in their offense has produced 2 receivers of 1,000 plus receiving yards in the past. I mean, go back and look at Marvin Jones and Golden Tate a couple years back. This upcoming season, I won't be surprised if we find 2 1,000 yard receivers. And a guy like Marvin Jones with the capabilities that he has in the red zone, a couple touchdowns here and there, you find yourself with 8 touchdowns, you have yourself in, kind of climbing in this conversation and getting into tiers that we didn't really expect him to potentially join. Moving on to our next wide receiver, we have ourselves Jarvis Landry. Jarvis Landry is kind of slept on once again. Another one of these slot receivers that is going to catch the ball a lot and be a great value in a PPR, half PPR format. Yet they're undervalued because they don't have touchdown upside, or people are assuming they're not going to see the ball. But the fact of the matter is that Jarvis Landry has not been anything less than the number 15 wide receiver in half PPR since 2014. I mean, sure, he was a number 1 wide receiver when he was in Miami, but even since he's gotten here, he hasn't produced anything less than a number 15 wide receiver spot. all in all, those are incredible numbers, and I think Jarvis Landry deserves more respect. He's an F-tier player for me. Moving on, Hollywood Brown. Marquise Brown is going to be the number one quote-unquote wide receiver of this team, but he's not going to be the number one target because that'll be Mark Andrews. Regardless, Marquise Brown is similar to Tyreek Hill. Boom and bust. And though I think he might bust a little too often in terms of his overall weekly performances, ultimately, the booms will get him to a spot where you could potentially start him once every other week. And that in itself, as a wide receiver 3 or 4 on your team, valuable enough and, I think is cheap enough to take the risk and jump on. He's an F-tier receiver. Moving on, Brandon Cooks. In my opinion, this team needs a 1,000-yard number one wide receiver. They're without, DeAndre Hopkins, and ultimately, if Will Fuller gets hurt again, or Randall Cobb and Kenny Stills and this amalgam of a bunch of wide receivers doesn't pan out, Brandon Cooks is going to be the guy. I mean, he's caught 4 1,000-yard seasons from 2015 to 2018. Ultimately, he is the best receiver on this team, and he's probably going to step up into the number one role and be that for Deshaun Watson. Moving on, Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel's kind of slept on. Sure, he broke his foot this offseason. He should be on pace to come back. But if, in fact, there's a little bit of struggles, we leave him down here in this range because, again, you could probably draft him a little bit later. And if, in fact, he doesn't start in the first couple of weeks because he has a little bit of a setback, you'll be chilling. Because, to be honest, Deebo Samuel wasn't great until really the second half of the season. But once he was kind of picking up his stride and really becoming a focal point of this offense, he was unstoppable. From weeks 10 through 17, he was averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game. Put up what? I think it was 6 games out of the 7-game stretch in which it was 10 plus points. Deebo Samuel, half PPR monster. Moving on to the last wide receiver of this group. A guy that, though I've sworn against and I cannot draft him personally, I think in terms of a tier list in fantasy, AJ Green is very capable of being a middling F-tier wide receiver in which he's found himself some value because, again, if he stays healthy and if Joe Burrow is playing a pretty good, level of football this upcoming season, AJ Green can easily be a top 15 wide receiver. With that being said, his injuries are always going to haunt him, and they're always going to haunt me because I've invested so much in AJ Green over the past couple of years. And in that, I think, sure, he has value, but you got to be careful. You got to be very careful. Moving on. These upcoming wide receivers, again, we got a lot of more wide receivers to talk about, but again, if I miss any, it's only because there's just so many to talk about and I couldn't cover them all. Moving on, Sterling Shepard. I believe he's going to be the number one of this team. Ultimately, he's been a stud for this team when healthy. If he stays away from the concussions, doesn't have to deal with a hamstring injury and or a serious injury that holds him out for multiple weeks, Sterling Shepard's going to be funnel targeted by Daniel Jones. We saw it last year, and I know a lot of people have a lot of hype behind Darius Slayton, but again, Darius Slayton had 2 performances of 28 plus points, and outside of that was kind of a middling wide receiver. Sterling Shepard is the number one of this team going forward. I believe so. Moving on. Deontay Johnson. Juju Smith-Schuster, we talked about him a little bit earlier. And the fact of the matter is that in 2018, he was a monster with Antonio Brown on the other side of the field. Now, when we bring back Ben Roethlisberger, who last time we saw him in a full capacity was the 3rd best quarterback in fantasy, broke records in terms of completions and passing attempts, Deontay Johnson, as of this moment in time, is the number 2 wide receiver of the Steelers offense. And if Ben Roethlisberger comes back and plays as well as we expect him to, Deontay Johnson is going to have a lot of value. Moving on. Curtis Samuel, top 36 wide receiver last year, and to be honest, can easily do that once again this year with the improvement at quarterback. Though they bring in Robbie Anderson, and though Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore are gonna, haul in a bunch of targets, I do think that Curtis Samuel, whether it's on the ground, through the air, special teams, is going to make plays as he usually does, has a knack of finding the end zone, and once again, will be a wide receiver that you can slot in as your wide receiver 3 on a weekly basis, and he will find value for you. Moving on, John Brown. I did talk about Stephon Diggs and kind of filling into the John Brown role, but again, there's going to be opportunity for both these guys. And John Brown, in my opinion, was far too successful last year to kind of fall off this upcoming season in this Buffalo Bills offense. Therefore, he kind of sits in this wide receiver 3 conversation along with the guys to the left of him. Moving on, Emmanuel Sanders. Emmanuel Sanders is an older wide receiver, and though he's had a couple Achilles injuries here and there, last season he was pretty reliable within the Denver offense and or the 49ers offense. Now you bring him and you play him with probably the second or potentially the best quarterback he's ever played with in his career. With Peyton Manning, he was awesome. Now you bring in with Drew Brees, and Drew Brees is firing on all cylinders. You have yourselves a pretty good situation with Emmanuel Sanders potentially being a top 36 wide receiver if, in fact, he can see enough targets on a weekly basis to find that value. Moving on, Christian Kirk. If he's going to play opposite of DeAndre Hopkins, and DeAndre Hopkins is going to pull that double coverage, Christian Kirk is going to run free. I mean, the last couple seasons, he's had to be the number one wide receiver, and he's going to get the best cornerback on the respective week. But this upcoming season, he'll probably be going against the second best corner, probably won't see double coverage, and it will ultimately lead to his overall success, in my opinion. That's why I have Christian Kirk in this kind of G tier. Moving on. Will Fuller. Will Fuller got a haircut this offseason, I guess. And hopefully the haircut will kind of keep him healthy, because to be honest, Will Fuller's injuries have been a pain. And though they hurt my heart, I do think that Will Fuller, if he can stay healthy, can be an easy top 36 wide receiver with upside. We've seen him produce 14 fantasy points per game on average when he's played a full game with Deshaun Watson under center. That in itself, an incredible stat. And I think Will Fuller is a very capable wide receiver. He's just got to stay healthy. Moving on. Darius Slayton. I mentioned him before. A lot of people think that Darius Slayton can be the number one, and I think there's a possibility in there. And there's a conversation to be had there. But ultimately, I think Sterling Shepard wins that job. But both these guys are going to be asked to be the number 1 and 2 punch of this receiving game, outside of obviously a little bit of Golden Tate, Evan Ingram, and Saquon Barkley. But I think Daniel Jones takes a big step this year, and these two guys will be the main reason why. Moving on. The H tier. Preston Williams starts the H tier coming off an ACL injury. I think in this offense, they need another receiver. They're not going to have Albert Wilson. They're not going to have Jakeem Grant really doing anything, because he typically doesn't. Alan Hearns is not playing this year. Outside of Devontae Parker, they don't really have any receiving options, perhaps outside of him and Mike Gesicki. So Preston Williams is going to have to come in, and he's going to have to produce. And in the last game he played last season, prior to his injury, he was a 20-point guy. I mean, he put up 20-plus points, tore his ACL, gone. And he's going to potentially be a guy that can come into this offense, be a 10-point-per-week player at the wide receiver position if, in fact, the quarterback play and the targets and opportunity allow it. Larry Fitzgerald. Larry Fitzgerald, though, he's old. And he's been in the league for a long time. What is it, his 16th year this upcoming season? Larry Fitzgerald is going to still find value because he's the number one, slot receiver of this team. He's going to pull, some terrible coverage from linebackers or safeties that aren't really going to kind of cover him well enough. Because, again, Larry Fitzgerald, despite how old he is, he's a legend. And ultimately deserves the respect and probably will be on a fantasy roster eventually by this year, whether he's drafted or not off the rip. I think ultimately he's going to be a pretty good producer this upcoming season. Moving on, Anthony Miller, another one of these slot receivers who, in my opinion, is going to improve. I mean, last year at the end of the season, had a couple games down the stretch in a full PPR in which he was a reliable number 2 wide receiver because of the opportunity he was given. But if you're not giving an Anthony Miller 8 targets a game, it's going to be a lot harder for us to rely upon him this upcoming season. But I think, in fact, if Nick Foles wins the job there, we know how much he wants to target tight ends and the slot position. Anthony Miller can be a huge benefactor. And I kind of have a hard time ending my drafts and not picking Anthony Miller if, in fact, he's available down the stretch. Especially, 10th, 11th round, beautiful pickup. Moving on, CeeDee Lamb. This is where the wide receiver rookies kind of come into play. Wide receiver rookies, in my opinion, I don't want too many of them. But if I'm going to pick some, I got to pick some in offenses that they're going to see a lot of targets in. And when we look at what Randall Cobb produced last year at the slot position for the Dallas Cowboys, CeeDee Lamb fits in perfectly, could potentially get 800 receiving yards like Randall Cobb did last year, maybe more. Maybe we find ourselves with 3 1,000-yard receivers in this offense because that's definitely their goal and could be a potential this upcoming season. So, again, the H tier for him. Jalen Reagor, another one of these wide receiver rookies. Again, like I mentioned, the rookies are coming down the line here. Reagor is going to be probably the number 1 wide receiver of this team, mainly because the other wide receivers, who we'll talk about in a bit, are going to get injured. Ultimately, he's a damn fast wide receiver. Watching his film is pretty entertaining, to say the least. Carson Wentz needs wide receivers. They went ahead and they invested in a wide receiver in this NFL draft for a reason. Hopefully, they'll find a chemistry, and eventually he'll become the number 1 wide receiver of this team, in which it'll pretty much increase his value to the G or F tier by the end of the season. Moving on. Another rookie wide receiver, we have ourselves Henry Ruggs III. And the thing is with Henry Ruggs, yes, he's probably going to be the number 1 wide receiver to this team. And no, I understand there's a lot of talks about this Bryan Edwards being a Devontae Adams for the Raiders or Hunter Renfrow. Where is he going to kind of lie in this offense if Henry Ruggs is playing the slot? Honestly, all I know is that Henry Ruggs is an incredible talent and that they drafted him in the first round for a reason. They're going to target him. Derek Carr needs a number one. They got rid of Amari Cooper for a reason, and now they need to go ahead and replenish that spot. Hopefully they'll do that with Henry Ruggs this year, and he can produce. Moving on. Sammy Watkins. I'm not a huge fan of Sammy Watkins because last year, outside of one good performance in week 1, he was pretty much average. And though I think as soon as Tyreek Hill comes back, it will open up more for Sammy Watkins, he's not a guy that I can rely upon every week. And that's why he sits in this tier, because I can't rely upon a rookie every week. Unless they're, of course, A.J. Brown in that stretch or Deebo Samuel in that stretch of games. But ultimately, if Sammy Watkins finds relevancy, I won't be surprised. Because, again, he's got the best quarterback in the National Football League. And he did play pretty well down the stretch last season, if and when the offense was fully healthy and ready to go. Moving on to our next wide receiver, N'Keal Harry. Second-year guy, hopefully can make strides towards success this upcoming season. Could potentially be the Devin Funchess and or Kelvin Benjamin of the Patriots offense. When I say those names, it's mainly because Cam Newton needs a big-bodied wide receiver to throw the ball to. No matter how inaccurate it is, the guy is going to be able to catch it in his potential wingspan. That's why I kind of say that. But regardless, moving on to the last tier of players. And I'm already losing my voice. I'm not even kidding. It's because I've been talking for an hour straight. But Mecole Hardman starts the I tier. And to be honest, he's very boom or bust. Similar to Marquise Brown, similar to Tyreek Hill. But the problem with Mecole Hardman is outside of one game of catching the ball 4 times last year, the most catches he had in a game was like 2, 1, 2, 1, 3. The fact that he's not catching the ball more than 2 times a game makes me think that he is legitimately a flip of the coin. Sure, on a week you might flip the coin and he scores, a 74-yard touchdown on 1 catch. But the following week, he gets 1 point, maybe 0.6 points, 1 catch for 1 yard. Whoops. That's the problem with Mecole Hardman. Far too boomer bust for me. And with so much talent in this offense, I think he's the 4th, 5th, 6th offensive option in this offense, out behind Tyreek Hill, Kelsey, Clyde Edwards, Sammy Watkins. He's like the 5th option. Demarcus Robinson's still there. Tough. Moving on. Let's talk about Golden Tate, the last Giants wide receiver of the list. Golden Tate last season was averaging 10 points per game after serving his suspension in the first 4 weeks. I think in the slot position was very reliable, but again was reliable because everybody else in that offense was getting injured. Saquon Barkley missed games, Evan Ingram missed games, Sterling Shepard missed games, Darius Slayton missed games. If in fact that happens again this year, Golden Tate will be relied upon and can definitely be a weekly pickup and play. Moving on, Jerry Jeudy, another rookie wide receiver. I think Jerry Jeudy's an incredible talent, but what do we expect to see from Drew Lock? If Drew Lock steps up and is that sophomore monster like Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen was last year, or Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson the year before, Jared Goff and Carson Wentz the year before that, if we end up seeing this trend continue and Drew Lock can be the stud, then Jerry Jeudy will definitely be a potential steal this upcoming season. But as of this moment in time, not too convinced. Justin Jefferson, another rookie wide receiver, fills in for Stephon Diggs in this offense. An offense that has had 2 top 12 wide receivers before. I don't know if they're going to use this, the second wide receiver as much this upcoming season. They want to pound the rock. They want to use double tight ends. And though that is the case, Justin Jefferson will be a decent number 2 wide receiver for his team. But will he be a decent wide receiver in fantasy? I guess time will tell. And with these rookie wide receivers, you could take the risk on them and draft them. But again, you're going to have to wait and you're going to have them sit. And then over time, they'll either mature and produce or they'll end up being busts ultimately. Regardless, another rookie wide receiver, Denzel Mims, similar situation. In an offense where there is really no number 1 outside wide receiver, Denzel Mims has to come in, beat Rashad Perriman, and try to kind of, find himself some success here. Robbie Anderson had a couple games here and there last season where he scores a touchdown on a big play, and there's definitely a capability for Denzel Mims, and that's why he kind of sits here because he has that upside. Speaking of one-play touchdowns, Deshaun Jackson, welcome. To be honest, Deshaun Jackson's probably a couple games until he gets injured and is out because, remember last year? He had 1 game of 31 points and then disappeared for the whole season because he's old and he gets injured. And that in itself doesn't really make him an intriguing prospect, but shows potential that, if you want to start him in a really good matchup, he could produce. They play against the Washington football team week 1. he could end up having another good week, similar to last year. The last wide receiver I want to mention, who's currently hurt and will probably miss week 1, but I think can be a touchdown monster because he has been in the past. I mean, damn, he was a number 24 wide receiver last year with a very disappointing season. Still surpassed 1,000 yards and could definitely be a touchdown hauling machine if, in fact, this offense finds their stride. It's Mike Williams in the Los Angeles Chargers offense, who I think is a capable wide receiver, but he's got to get healthy. And until then, sits down there. Now, I know I did not cover every wide receiver, but again, I can only talk so long. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please smash the like button. Let's get that over 1,000 if we can. Again, thank you very much for the support. For those of you looking for more information, official rankings, playing a league with me, Discord server, down in the description, patreon.com/Andrew Kiorkof or andrewkiorkof.com for the draft kit only or draft guide only. Wow, I'm tired. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And I really do appreciate the support. Until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.